you here today for the official launch of our series, and would like to thank the UQ Advantage office who are actually sponsoring us. We'd like to thank the speakers and of course yourselves for coming and your support. So let's begin. True or false? Government surveillance in Australia has gone too far. That is what we're here to debate. So we have two teams with a wealth of knowledge and experience in this field. But before I introduce them, I'd like to note that we have a live Twitter feed. So just use the hashtag UQDS public debate. And that would be amazing. So also, you guys are the judges for this debate. So you're going to be asked to vote before and after, and we'll see who changes the most minds at the end of the debate. That will be named our winner. So let's go to the first preliminary vote. Awesome, it's on the screen. So you can go to that URL, or you can scan it if you're really tech savvy. And I'm going to be introducing the speakers while I do this. So first, on the affirmative team, we have Professor Mark Burton. Dr. Burton is a UQ lecturer at the School of Law and has worked on a diverse range of projects, including the reporting of data breaches, e-government information frameworks, consumer protection, e-commerce, and information protection standards for e-courts. His PhD investigated data breach notification and information privacy laws. So let's welcome him again. Our second speaker on the affirmative team is Professor Catherine Gelber. Professor Gelber is a UQ professor in public policy and an expert in Australian politics, contemporary political theories, and human rights. She has been continually recognised for her outstanding work concerning human rights. So let's welcome her. And finally, on the affirmative team, we have James Rigby. Now, for those who don't know, James is the president of the UQDS Society and is a fourth-year Laws Economics student at UQ. And he's been an active member for quite some time, and he's competed at multiple Australasian and World Championships. Actually, in 2012, James was a national grand finalist at the Australian InterVarsity Debating Tournament. So let's make the affirmative team welcome. Now, for the negative team, we've had a bit of a change of order, but firstly, we have Associate Professor David Martin Jones. He's like an expert in international security, Australian defence policy, international terrorism, and maintains an interest in democratic politics. He's published several academic pieces on terrorism across the globe. So let's make him feel welcome. Now, speaking second on the negative team is Professor Jim Allen. Professor Jim Allen is a UQ lecturer at the School of Law, and he's participated in numerous lectures, debates, and talks, including Q&A. Professor Allen maintains an interest in constitutional law, evidence, legal theory, and moral philosophy, and is continually recognised for his publications. Let's welcome him. Now, our final member on the negative team is Antonia. Antonia is a second-year law art student at UQ and is actually the tournament's officer for 2015. She's an active debater, and she was the semi-finalist and 7th best speaker in the 2015 Easters competition. So let's welcome her. I'm going to quickly outline the format of the debate. So speeches will be 7 minutes, one bell at 5 minutes, 2 bells at 7 minutes, and 3 bells at 7:30, and then just stopping after that.
We'll do the bell.
So it looks like everyone's finished voting, and to remind you again, the initial vote will be tabulated, and then we'll make you vote at the end of the debate to see who's changed the most minds, and they will be our winner. So now to the debate. Our motion is government surveillance in Australia has gone too far. Speaking first for the motion, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mark Burton to open the debate.
Thanks, Catalina. Today we debate the motion that government surveillance in Australia has gone too far. What we are considering here are the after effects of 9/11 and new technological responses to meet increasingly perceived terrorist threats. We're going to talk about two forms of surveillance programs and technologies. First, data retention schemes such as the EU data retention scheme and the recently implemented Australian scheme through the Telecommunications Interception Act. These schemes allow for the capture and recording of telecommunications data, details about our telecommunications activities rather than the content of the communications themselves, and we'll come back to that point. This data can be held for up to 2 years in Australia and can be accessed without warrant by law enforcement agencies during that period. Second, we're also going to consider the secret technological programs and networks revealed by Edward Snowden, in which the Five Eyes governments have used national security laws as a justification to hoover up details of all of the world's telecommunications details. Literally trillions upon trillions of records. Yours, mine, the other teams, everybody's. Now, courts in different parts of the world are starting to question the legality of these schemes. And it should be noted right at the onset of this debate and borne throughout that an individual's right to privacy is enshrined in foundational legal instruments. Article 17 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution. It also needs to be borne in mind that Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights that protects privacy or any other rights for that matter. Our right and our need for privacy requires the Australian government to balance the privacy rights of individuals and the collective needs of national security. We contend that balance isn't given sufficient accord. And in conjunction with rapid technological development, we're arguing that government surveillance has simply gone too far in Australia. I'm going to put forward two arguments to support that contention. First, we're not talking about surveillance, we're talking about mass surveillance. Second, the use of metadata is extremely privacy intrusive. So let's start with surveillance and mass surveillance. Leading surveillance studies scholar, Professor David Lyon, defines surveillance as the focused, systematic and routine attention to personal details for certain purposes. The purposes of influence, management, protection or direction. So let's take that definition apart. Focused is about learning information about individuals. It's fine-grained and detailed watching. Systematic is the fact that it's planned and carried out. It's rational rather than random or arbitrary. Routine is that part of the everyday fabric of our society. And purposeful is that it has an identifiable justification or goal. In our case, we're talking about protection, security. These elements envisage surveillance as something that's actively undertaken. It involves accountable activities of the state for defined purposes, and it's targeted towards particular groups or individuals. Now, we've got a little problem with this activity. If it's conducted legally, we acknowledge that there's bad guys out there, and steps need to be taken to protect society by closely watching potential terrorist subjects. However, the processes of metadata collection aren't about the active surveillance of small numbers of individuals. Instead, they're about the mass surveillance of all of us, which data about us is collected passively as we go about our everyday lives. This mass recording of our everyday histories means that watching and tracking all societal life is now becoming the norm. And this is an extremely dangerous norm, because we become the watched and we also provide the surveillance apparatus for the watching. Now, none of this is the purposeful, focused, systematic collection of data for surveillance. Instead, this is about ever-expanding and ubiquitous forms of data collection. Governments are doing this simply because they can. This point was acknowledged by the European Court of Justice in the Digital Rights Island case of last year, which invalidated the EU Data Retention Directive. The court held that the directive was a serious interference of fundamental rights to a private life and the protection of personal data. Now, it has to be acknowledged that the Australian data retention scheme is built around the criticisms of Digital Rights Ireland from the European Court of Justice. But the underlying principle still remains. These systems of mass surveillance, by their nature, are extremely privacy intrusive because data retention threatens individual autonomy, a point recognised by the ECJ and a point I'll come back to in conclusion. So let's stick with data and let's move on to the metadata argument. The collection of metadata is justified because it's less intrusive. The argument goes like this. Metadata regards the details of the communication rather than the communication itself. The where, who, when, and how. So vast amounts of metadata can be collected and recorded without anyone reading the content of communications. That simply doesn't work in our telecommunications and online environments because you can infer the content of the communication from the metadata.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burden. I'd now like to welcome Professor David Jones to open the negativity case.
Okay, we're all academics, so we get at least 10 minutes. So the argument is, are we living in a police state where rights and privacy are curtailed in order to sustain an unaccountable techno-tyranny in Australia? I don't think so. That seems to be the argument the opposition is mounting. The weasel word surveillance translates immediately into the term the surveillance state, aka the police state. Yet who exactly is being spied upon? And why the need for surveillance, greater or lesser? What the word actually means, because I actually looked it up, it comes from the French surveiller, to watch over. Well, we probably do need watching over in an era of durable disorder and an ongoing war, which is cyber war. We paradoxically need more watching over the social media to secure the practice of our political freedom in a political order which we happen to enjoy and which Islamic State, Russia and China do not. These are police states, we're not. Firstly, and to come back to the question that's the dilemma of a democracy, the use of intelligence and secrecy has from its inception been central to the modern political constitutional condition. With the collapse of Christendom from the 16th century into a state of fundamental chaos, the emerging modern state had to have intelligence to guard itself against forces within and without that sought to destroy it. Whether it was the papacy and the Jesuits in the 17th century, Hitler and Stalin in the 20th, or Islamic State in the 21st, we faced open societies faced the dilemma of requiring intelligence, spying, secrecy, to determine the necessary terms for the state order upon which political freedoms might be enjoyed. Before the citizen has rights, the state's right to determine its security came prior. That was the basis of the modern understanding of raison d'etat, right of state. Without that right to order, we have no possibility of political rights. Machiavelli made the point very early on. Most people are ruled by reason and law, but some men are beasts. Therefore, you need intelligence to find out who they are. So, prior to pluralism, political freedom, and public-private spheres, we need peace, order, and stability. The alternative is an anarchy, and not a hip anarchy, but the kind of anarchy and chaos we see every day in states without order or a common framework of law. That applies to all citizens, as Hobbes, of course, classically observed. A state of absolute right to anything, results only in the war of all against all, and the condition of man, which is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The successive Western governments have therefore faced the perpetual dilemma. Democratic societies demand openness about what is being done in their name, but key aspects of the way that police, security, and intelligence agencies operate must remain secret in order to be effective. Moreover, the current security threat we place is more serious than anything that went before in the 20th century. We face a new order of techno surveillance and techno penetration, which is totally new. We're living in a constitutional understanding that doesn't address the need for a regulation of the cyber order. You are aware of it. You are digital natives. My generation is a digital migrant. Those who run our states and our police services actually are like me. They're antediluvian. But even you recognize the consequences in terms of communication opportunities and the manner in which they can be perverted. Herein lies the big dilemma. Technology is neutral, and though it might be created in the context of an open society, it is closed and autocratic ones, criminals, illiberal ideologists, and Islamist terrorists who found it most conducive to their essentially anti-political ends. As an Obama advisor recently commented, national government agencies have had a period of 20 years underinvestment in cybersecurity. Recently, Peace, a UK-based activist, hacked into the US Department of Energy, got access to the nuclear weapons system. If the peace activists can do it, so can Chinese and Russian cyber warriors do it, which is a constant problem now for the US and Western security agencies that have resulted in a defense bonanza. Yet government technology and encryption is limited, poor, and at least 10 years behind private practice. By contrast, Russian and Chinese autocrats have no problem in hosting whistleblowers from purported Western surveillance states like Edward Snowden. They also have no problem in introducing real and total surveillance over their social media. China, rather wisely, doesn't allow Facebook. It does have its own media chat operations, however, with its own security police embedded in them. Meanwhile, our data gathering agencies don't have the links or the technology that Google, Facebook, and Apple have to access big data, and they refuse to share it with government. This would be risible if it was not so dangerous. And in this brave new world we've created, of course, the most well-known exponents of the dark web and new social media are Islamic State. Since the second generation leaders of the global jihad movement designed their online strategy after 2004, the Islamic State operation launches over 100,000 Facebook, Twitter messages a day. Not only recruiting online foreign fighters, but actually promoting attacks in the UK and elsewhere. Here. So, as the Twitter assault that Islamist radicals are running at the extent of our liberal commitment to a secular life is something we should really be sincerely attending to. It seems self-evident that we need greater surveillance and retention of internet data. The converse to this would to accept that terrorists should have the means of communication that they are confident and beyond the sight of ASIO acting with proper legal warrant. New laws, of course, need to be both targeted and accountable. If we don't take the problem that getting data security right is the price of freedom, then I'm afraid we live in the land where the people of Cloud Cuckoo Land, we live in the place where the people from Cloud Cuckoo Land go for their holidays, aka, in our case, the HAS faculty.
So much, Professor Jones, and now I'd like to welcome the second speaker, Professor Gelber, to continue their team's case.
I'm afraid somebody forgot to tell the negative team what the topic of tonight's debate was. They think that we're debating whether or not Australia is a police state. We are doing no such thing. We are debating the topic of whether surveillance has gone too far. not whether IS represents a threat. We're debating surveillance. Secondly, the argument that David Martin-Jones made is akin to, and we've heard this many, many times before, we will defend your freedom by taking away your freedom. I'm afraid I don't find that very convincing. I'm going to talk tonight about 3 points that support the argument that surveillance in Australia has gone too far. Firstly, what we do know about Australia's involvement in surveillance, mass surveillance, the kind of surveillance Dr. Burden was talking about. Secondly, the lack of accountability involved with those mechanisms of surveillance. And thirdly, what's been described as Australia's hyper-legislating in this area in the context of the counter-terrorist threat, and therefore the topic of tonight's debate. Firstly, we know from a number of sources, partly from Snowden's revelations, partly from journalists reporting of those revelations and of other matters, partly from freedom of information requests, and partly from government's own admissions, these are not just Snowden revelations, that mass surveillance is being coordinated among Western countries, and in particular for Australia by what's called the Five Eyes Alliance. That is an alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. These countries all undertake mass surveillance activities and share the information between them at extremely high levels, information that we are not privy to. This is coordinated by the National Security Agency of the United States, and the data that is shared is all related to what is called a pre-criminal investigation, or what I call pre-criminal investigations. In other words, the mass surveillance that Mark Burden was talking about. After Snowden's revelations were made public in mid-2013, journalists in Australia lodged freedom of information requests. The results of those requests, although very heavily redacted, because the government's allowed to know everything it wants to know, but we're not allowed to know what it knows about us, those reports were heavily redacted and nevertheless showed that successive Australian governments have known for years and years about the surveillance programs and have actively participated in the Five Alliance in the sharing of information. What that sharing of information means is that when a country can't collect enough data on its own, through its own resources, it can rely on the data collected on its citizens by other members of that alliance. Incidentally, that information also revealed that it is possible through some of the surveillance techniques being used to intercept content of communications, like the mobile phone calls of the Indonesian president. But we won't go further into that detail today. So, we know that Australia is participating in this mass surveillance. We know quite a lot about it in spite of the high secrecy. 2, accountability mechanisms. What about accountability mechanisms in ensuring this surveillance does not go too far? There are 3 things I want to talk about here. Firstly, the claim, as hinted at by David Martin-Jones, that mass surveillance has kept us safe from terrorism. I'm afraid that is simply an unverifiable claim. The United States government and the Australian government have constantly claimed that surveillance programs keep us safe. They've even specifically claimed that they have disrupted plots. However, journalists and Congress people and people all around the world have disputed that claim. It was so disputed that in December 2013, President Barack Obama ordered a review group. He put together an independent review group on intelligence and communications technologies to investigate the use of mass data collected through mass surveillance. And that independent review reported, so this is President Obama's review, reported that mass telephony data had not been essential in preventing terrorist attacks in the United States, and that information which had been useful to disrupting terrorist plots could have been obtained in a timely manner through ordinary channels such as traditional court orders and warrants. In January 2014, a non-government organisation report in the Washington Post came to the identical conclusion. Mass data collection has played no significant role in preventing terrorist attacks in the countries in which it is undertaken. Secondly, the legality of surveillance has come under serious question. Bart Burden has already spoken about that. Within a month of the Snowden revelations, that people in Congress in the United States were expressing great unease at what was now known about the mass domestic surveillance that had been undertaken in the people's name and suggested that relevant parts of the Patriot Act might not be reauthorised in June this year when they came up for reauthorisation. That actually happened. That they did not get reauthorised in the Patriot Act because there had just recently been a federal court decision in the United States, ACLU v. Clapper, which affirmed that the use of the relevant section of the Patriot Act to undertake mass telephony data collection had not actually been legally authorised. So in the US we have a court system saying actually the things that the FISA court has been claiming for years are legal actually aren't. In Australia we don't have that mechanism. We don't have a mechanism like that that can actually call it to account and look at the actual legality of what has been undertaken. Thirdly, other mechanisms for holding the government to account. The response in Australia to the accusation that we have no domestically enforceable human rights standard against which to hold governments to account is, oh, we've got responsible government, that's okay. What have we seen from our parliament? What have we seen in the form of parliamentary opposition? What have we seen in the form of parliamentary scrutiny? We have counter-terrorism legislation going through Parliament in record time, record amounts of legislation in record time. I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling that responsible government is taking care of us here. We don't have the accountability mechanisms. So my conclusion on that point is that we have a dearth of mechanisms, no significant parliamentary opposition and a lack of accountability. Thirdly, hyper-legislating. Kent Roach has called what the Australian government has done hyper-legislation in the counter-terrorism arena. But up to 2011, the Australian government had passed 55 new pieces of counter-terrorism legislation since 9/11. Recently, that figure has moved up to 65, with the Citizenship Bill currently being considered moving that up to 66. The most recent versions of this hyper-legislating include amending the definition of a computer to include all or part of one or more computers, computer systems, networks, or any combination of the above. So a warrant designed to collect information from one computer can apply to a whole computer network, i.e. the entire internet. There's a new offence for the unauthorised disclosure of information related to a special operation, with the Attorney General getting to decide what a special intelligence operation is, including retrospectively. There's a new offence for disclosing information gathered by a security organisation. There's a new mandation, of course, of storage of data. In conclusion, we have engaged in this surveillance absolutely fervently and robustly. We have hyper-legislated in the counter-terrorism context. There's little to no accountability, and Glenn Greenwald has described Australia in this area as being one of the most aggressive in the world.
I'd now like to welcome the second speaker of the negative team, Professor Allen.
Nobody told me this was a speed talking night. I had no plan. Look, I'd like to just start by thanking all of you for coming tonight. I suppose you must be the last group of people on campus with nothing better to do. No parties, no hot dates. You want to come to actually something that's organized by a debating society, possibly co-sponsored by the Women's Temperance Union, I'm not sure. But look, enough of the frivolities. This is an important debate. It's even being filmed, it's being recorded. You guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Seriously? Okay. I wanted to point that out. Now look, let me make a few basic points, all right? And then I'll be done. When I got contacted about this debate, I said, well, what are we going to do, flip coins to pick sides? Because actually, in a way, I could have gone either way on this one. There's a very respectable libertarian argument to be made about this. If any of you, and this is the sort of crowd who probably would have watched the Republican debates yesterday because you really have nothing else to do, but if you watched the Republican debates, you would have seen a heated dispute between Senator Rand Paul, a real hard-nosed libertarian, and Governor Chris Christie on exactly this debate tonight. On the one side, in favor of usage, you had Chris Christie, and on the other side, he'd make the same sort of points that David Jones was making, and on the other side, you had the most libertarian, and in that sense, the most right-wing member of the US Senate, saying we shouldn't have any government surveillance at all. And, you know, the problem is, said Christie, that when you have people who are prepared to use incredible levels of violence, to fly planes into buildings, that sort of thing, that in a way, the position our friends are taking is really, it's a form of moral self-indulgence. It's a bit like moral masturbation. Look at me, aren't I wonderful? Look at my civil libertarian credentials. If I'm really lucky, Julian Burnside might invite me to his party. I mean, come on. Now, on balance, I'm on Christie's side. You know, but if we were faced tonight by real civil libertarian, real libertarians, the sort of Rand Paul, or in Australia's context, Sinclair Davidson, well, that's a hard case to answer because they don't want government involved in anything, right? They're consistent. Are these people consistent? I mean, they don't want government to collect data that might stop terrorist attacks, but they also are perfectly happy for government to get involved to stop people from seeing things that might offend somebody or might humiliate somebody. This is a crowd who have no problem with hate speech laws. Now, I don't see that as all that consistent. Libertarians are consistent. They hate government involved in everything, and that's a hard case to deal with sometimes. But, you have to be a little bit consistent, I think. I don't think there's much danger of that from these people, but let's move on here. Historically, this debate takes place in the context of national security. That's when civil liberties sometimes have to bend. In the Second World War, Winston Churchill took the leader of the fascist party, Oswald Mosley, put him in jail. There were no going to court. He just put him in jail. It was probably the right thing to do. One of the great American presidents in terms of civil liberties, right? Abraham Lincoln. He suspended habeas corpus. And when the judges said you can't do that, he just ignored the judges. He ignored them. This is Abraham Lincoln. Because, when real lives are at stake, these people talk criminal law as if, if you think there might be a plot, are you going to wait till they commit the offense and then use the whole edifice of the criminal law with the burden of proof and the presumption of innocence? Or are you actually going to try to stop them before they do it? If you stop them before they do it, you don't get a conviction. That's how it works. So it's a very difficult thing. You can't know who it is in advance. In both cases, in the Lincoln and Churchill cases, liberalism just sort of muddles through. And it muddles through by shunning the demand for ruthless consistency, the sort of idea that I have to have an unbending attachment to some sort of civil liberty that's articulated in the language of rights. Kent Roach, who was mentioned, I know the guy. There's never been a single time that I know of where the judges have overruled an elected legislature where he's not jumping up and down going, great job, judges. He is the most, for him, I'm not sure what democracy means, but it sure doesn't mean that politicians have the last word on anything. So here's some questions for you. The real issue is, how big a threat do you think we're facing? If it's not a big threat, then of course they're right. Of course they are. If we're talking shoplifting, if we're talking pornography, if we're talking something like that, we don't want this metadata. Personally, I wish I had something interesting enough on my phone that somebody would want to take it. But somehow my life hasn't gone right on that front. If the threats are real and plausible, though, it's a really weird position to say, and to start quoting Edward Snowden. If you've read Dante, this is a guy who should be consigned to the seventh circle of hell. He has taken information from countries that are the best places on earth to live. People want to move to all of the countries that Catherine's talking about. And he has allowed that information to be used by countries like Russia and China. These are hellholes of illiberalism, let's be honest. There's something terribly wrong with a person who does that and can't even see the problem. So what we're really talking here is a form of what's called the paradox of liberalism. Right? The paradox of liberalism works like this. Liberal state basically is something committed to freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. And what do you do when you're faced with somebody who wants to use those entitlements to advance illiberal goals? Take free speech. They want to use the entitlement for free speech to try to bring about the end of the state that allows them to have free speech. This is the paradox of liberalism. If a country opts to outlaw illiberal actions, it sort of gnaws away at its own credentials in the sort of way that we're hearing over here, isn't this awful? But if you ignore it and you permit the illiberalism, what you end up is you could potentially be bringing about the demise of the country that actually has liberal values. It's a paradox. Robert Frost, again, great American poet, he quipped, why can't liberalism take its own side in any argument? Because it's a part of the problem with liberalism. And how do you cut this Gordian knot? And really, at the end of the day, the only way you can do it, because we know liberal states exist, is you just muddle through. And the only source of protection at the end of the day is the good sense of the voters in your country to know when it's proper to say to the elected people, look, you're going too far, and at other times to say, we're not going to demand unbending consistency. It's ridiculous. Nobody complained when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus except a few lawyers. And nobody said to Churchill, you know, you really ought to let the leader of the Nazi party out to sort of campaign. You just have to be a little bit flexible on that so we can escape it. So let me sum it up this way for you. I was going to say, could you imagine trying to rerun World War II today with the sort of attitudes and the lawyer, judge-driven attitudes we're hearing from? We wouldn't win. We would lose. It's pretty clear. So let me sum this up for you. It's not about surveillance. It's about why is the government doing this surveilling? If you think we face something that's a bit scary and dangerous, you're going to be a little bit more flexible about this. If you see the world in terms of we want the same legal protections that we would give to shoplifters afforded people who are crazy and like to behead people, then of course you're going to say this is a flexible moving line. And on balance, I think the smart thing in this case, and it's close because I like the libertarian case, but on balance, you ought to probably go down the surveillance line.
I'd like to welcome the last member of the affirmative team to conclude this team's case, James.
Is the clock running?
Well, unlike Professor Allen, I wasn't watching a Republican debate yesterday because I did have something better to do. But we never needed to be crazy libertarians and justify everything on this side of the house. We just wanted to muddle through in a way that saw no erosion of fundamental rights that were the reason people wanted to move to countries like the United States rather than live in countries like China, where the government did monitor everything they did and the government controlled their internet. They wanted to be in a freer state. That's why they moved to the United States. We thought eroding that in the United States, and particularly in Australia, where it's now even worse than in the US, which has just undone the things that Australia is now doing, we thought that was the problem with Australia's government surveillance, and that's why it's gone too far. Three issues in this debate. Firstly, do we need this level of surveillance to protect us from terror? Secondly, on privacy, its intrusion, why we actually care about privacy, which is often quite a vague, amorphous thing otherwise, which is why I'm told we don't put it in bills of rights. And thirdly, on accountability and overreach, and why that actually matters in this debate. So, do we need this level of surveillance to protect us from terror? We've been told that there's the threat from IS. You know, they might get up on the live Twitter feed and convert you all. The problem with that was, well, there are a couple of problems. The first was that you'd probably just see the tweet and delete it if you were the government without having to get the metadata. But we didn't need to be afraid of those Facebook messages from IS, those sorts of things. That wasn't where the real threat was. And we could identify those threats by using normal surveillance without gathering the metadata of every citizen and storing it in a honeypot that meant people were more likely to hack into the government's servers and steal all of this data, or more likely to hack into Telstra's or Optus's or IINet or some other incompetent telephone company. They can't bill you correctly. They won't be able to protect 2 years of your data retained either. Yeah. Don't get me started on Telstra. We've been told, though, that the problem with terrorism is you need more. You can't use the criminal law and all of the protections that are built into that, you know, just a burden of proof, whatever. The problem is that we use those protections for a reason. And moreover, we can use protective things, like protected custody on someone. We don't need the metadata to enable us to do this. And it's not the sort of thing that will identify someone who's going to behead someone, because that's a single act. They don't need to communicate with anyone. That's the whole reason. That's the new frontier of terrorism. Metadata wasn't what we needed for that. Government surveillance, therefore, had gone too far when we weren't balancing it correctly, because there were diminishing returns for this extra surveillance, but there were extra costs to everyone in society when that occurred. We thought that that was not necessary to protect us. But finally, on cybersecurity, we were told that the government really needs to protect the internet from cyber attacks, that sort of thing. But of course, that wasn't through surveillance they needed to do that. So you probably just hire some engineers who were the relevant age, if that was the relevant qualification, right? We thought that, of course, the government needed to protect data, but the best way to protect it would be not to collect a huge amount of data or get telecommunication companies to collect a huge amount of data, a honeypot, I'm told the experts call it, to then to make available for people to attack. We thought that made things worse. What we say is that Australia is going against the rest of the world here. Australia, unlike the United States and the UK, isn't curtailing this. The Freedom Act has just, in the United States, well named, has just undone, like all US acts, undone the huge parts of the Patriot Act and acts empowering the NSA. In Australia, we're just doing the opposite. We're adding these. And the US has realised that this isn't necessary for the protection of their people, because the US has always taken terrorism seriously. I don't think I need to sort of explain why the US would not do this if it actually presented a real threat. But secondly, then, onto privacy. So we had to balance this against the harm, which just muddled through, as it were. We told you that privacy was important for a few reasons. The first was that as a right it was important. We thought people behaved differently when their privacy was different. We thought people would speak differently when they were being watched, and that meant that people would not act in the same way. We thought that was important to protect people's individual privacy. That's why this was different to things like hate speech, right? Because it wasn't about saying something in the paper or talking about, or being Andrew Bolt, publishing something in a column. This was about things in the private sphere that the government was then intervening in, something that for society had always been treated as different. And even if it meant that maybe in 40 years, once everyone's used to everyone watching them constantly, the selfie generation or whatever, as columns in the paper like to call it, maybe in 40 years it'll be justified because everyone's okay with that social norms have changed, even if that were true. But it certainly isn't the case now that social norms are such that that's acceptable. And we think that is why this right exists, because people behave as if to expect they're not being watched. And at that point, we think that they have a right not to, when that's accepted as a norm in society. But we thought there was also a harm. People's behaviour changed when they were watched. And we were told that it wasn't a harm that mattered because people still wanted to live in Australia, still wanted to live in the US. Yeah, sure, we have like money and other important rights. This was perhaps like less important than some of those, but we thought that at the point at which we did live in Australia, we should limit that to a useful level rather than excessive. Who here's got an iPhone? Okay, so I want you to open your iPhone, I want you to go to settings, and I want you to go to privacy, and then I want you to go to system services, and then scroll right down to the bottom, and then to frequent locations, etc. And you'll see to the minute the places you've been for every minute of the last month. The government, I can tell you when I met with my team to discuss this case, exactly at the Bell Rooftop Cafe. The government has access to the equivalent of that data when it has access to your metadata, because it knows every time you send a text, every time you're in a place and you make a phone call, you send a message, you send an email. That is the level of data the government has. And if you have a look at that, you'll understand just how sort of creepy that is. On our side of the house, even if the only harm was people who shouldn't be worried getting creeped out, we thought that was a big enough harm when it applied towards society. We thought drawing the balance required that. But finally, on accountability, and this was, I think, some of the most important material in this debate. We told you there was no accountability. It was exactly the material that was brought to us about it must be secret to be effective that was the reason that agencies got away with having no accountability whatsoever. Moreover, the bipartisanship we saw in Australia, like the best opposition we've got is we only in principle support it and we'll probably pass it when we see the bill, but maybe we won't. That's the best opposition we've got in Australia. With that level of accountability, or lack thereof, it means that these agencies will always overreach. These agencies will end up detaining more people for 2 weeks without charge. These agencies will end up doing more. Because if you're hired by these agencies, if you believe that you should be doing this surveillance, then you're always going to say, well, we can justify this on the basis of protecting society. So you're always going to stand outside the law. You're always going to act further. We thought that when you gave these broad brush powers like we have in Australia, overlapping charges on many things, overlapping provisions about what data could be collected, it meant that agencies would always act further than they should have, and it meant that the Australian people had not consented to that level of interaction. That meant that those were too far because the people weren't consenting to it, but moreover, it intervened in their privacy for no real benefit.
Ladies and gentlemen, broadly speaking, the negative team agreed with the affirmative team that privacy was an important thing for people to have in their lives, and that people deserved a space in their life where they didn't fear government interference or surveillance, and that they could have that space. But we thought that when the internet was a space which was readily accessible for communication and information sharing by everyone in the world, including people with criminal intentions, we thought that when the internet was a space that was monopolised by internet service providers and corporations like Google and Gmail that already had the capacities to access and store your information, we weren't convinced that the internet was a space in which people deserved the absolute kinds of rights to privacy that the affirmative team wanted to talk about. We thought the internet was somewhere where we could prioritise keeping people safe and international security. So 3 issues broadly in this debate. Firstly, can we draw a relevant principled distinction between targeted surveillance and the kind of mass surveillance the affirmative team had an issue with? Secondly, is there a relevant right to privacy? And thirdly, on the usefulness of these kinds of surveillance mechanisms. So firstly, on a distinction between targeted surveillance and mass surveillance, because they wanted to tell us that they were okay, generally speaking, with the kinds of targeted surveillance that law enforcement engages in the sense that they were okay with people having phone tapping warrants and search warrants and accessing people's online information in that way, but that they didn't support the kinds of metadata retention that were now available in Australia for a few reasons. Firstly, they wanted to say that the kinds of passive surveillance that are entailed by metadata retention aren't acceptable. What we would say in respect to that is that they were probably okay with other kinds of passive surveillance that happen every day. Things like the use of CCTV cameras in public spaces, things like as simple as having police in public spaces monitoring what the general public was doing. We thought all of that was the kind of passive surveillance that was very similar to metadata retention. And the reason that we were okay with some level of passive surveillance was that we thought it was impossible to preempt all the kinds of crime or any kind of potential wrongdoings that were going to happen at any given time. And so passive surveillance was really important for us to be able to retrospectively find out about those crimes and how they occurred. So we thought that passive surveillance was okay in some circumstances, particularly on the internet. Secondly, they wanted to say that it's not targeted and that it's not necessarily directed at individuals who are under suspicion for a specific crime. We thought that the way the metadata retention system worked was that we wouldn't sit there randomly mining through the Facebook accounts of like people who were ordinary Facebook users. We thought that metadata retention primarily had its strength in the fact that we could in that we could retrospectively look at a person of interest and go back through their phone records and their internet records and their email history. That was why metadata was so important, was because even though it wasn't necessarily targeted in the way that information was stored, it did allow us to engage in the kind of targeted surveillance that we thought was so important for preventing crime. But more than that, we thought that was the reason that metadata retention was so important and had so much value, because it gave us a capacity beyond targeted surveillance, and that we were always able to retrospectively access information, and we were able to get the details of a crime that had already occurred. We were able to find out more about it, but I'll discuss that more later. Secondly, on the issue of an incursion of privacy, they wanted to tell us that this represents a really severe incursion on people's right to privacy. And James wanted to tell you that you act differently when you feel as though you're being surveilled. You aren't inclined to do the same kinds of things. But what we would say in response to that was that the current measures that are in place in Australia, including metadata retention, really don't go that far beyond what was available beforehand, in the sense that corporations like Facebook and your email account still stored your metadata and had access to your metadata. They just have to retain it for a longer period of time now. Furthermore, we thought that people were okay with this kind of system because they understood that it was metadata that was being retained, and it wasn't as though the government was able to look through your Facebook account or look through your Snapchats. But more than that, God help us if they could do. But what we thought was that even to the extent that people weren't happy with the government being able to access that information, we thought that generally people were okay with this kind of information being stored, in the sense that Facebook stores all the information that you put on Facebook, and Snapchat stores all the pictures that you send on Snapchat. Yeah, I bet you know that, but they do. But more than that, we thought that people were okay with that happening. We thought that people were already acceptable with some level of retention of their information, and that they weren't that uncomfortable with that, and we didn't think this went that far beyond that. they wanted to tell us that broadly, if you sit down and you analyse someone's metadata for a couple of weeks, you might be able to work out, like who they're the person that they're in a relationship with, or if they're having medical appointments and things like that. What we said was that like there were never going to be the resources to sit down and pick a random person and try and work out, who their boyfriend or girlfriend was, and that probably wasn't how this information would be used. But to the extent that it was possible to analyse metadata to work out where a person had been going and who they'd been interacting with, we thought that that was why metadata was so useful. Because on the third issue of usefulness, James wanted to say that you can't preempt a heading using metadata, but what we did say was that when you had a person of interest, you were able to see if they were consistently accessing certain sites, if they were consistently communicating with another person of interest, and in the aftermath of a crime, you were able to go back and look at that person's call records and look at their email records and work out who that person had potentially collaborated with, who they'd spoken to in that time, who they'd talked to in the lead up to committing that crime. That was why metadata was so important, and that was why metadata retention was so important, because in the 2 years after the crime had occurred, you were still able to access that information retrospectively. We thought that in circumstances like the Boston bombings, where the Tsarnaev brothers had been recruited online and had accessed information about radical Islam online, that was when metadata retention was so important and was so useful to us. So because we thought it wasn't a huge incursion on people's privacy, we were still willing to weigh that up against the huge kinds of benefits that we got from these kinds of metadata retention, but also that kind of metadata retention in the context of international agreements about data sharing, which we thought was so helpful when we were talking about crimes that occurred internationally. So because we thought that weighing the minimal incursion on people's right to privacy against the massive practical benefits that we had from metadata retention and the current state of government surveillance in Australia, we were very happy to say that government surveillance in Australia had not gone too far.
Okay, so thank you so much, Antonia. Let's give them another round of applause. Now it's time to see who is our winner. So if you vote again, using this link, number 2 now, we can find out who changed the most minds and who's our winner. But whilst we're doing that, we're going to bring out some gifts that we have for the speakers. Where's Georgie? There you are. Yeah, so we'd like to thank the speakers for their continual support. They have a really busy schedule and they managed to take a little bit of time out to support the UQDS. And since this is our first series, we'd just like to share a little token of our appreciation.
You have to check for ID.
Yeah?
Taking the econ ball.
There you go. Oh, thank you so much.
So it shouldn't be too long to tabulate the results, and so just talk amongst yourselves, and yeah, it shouldn't be too long.
For data interpretation, straight from UQ's engineering faculty. At the start of the debate, roughly even support for both teams. At the end of the debate, slightly more support for the affirmative team than the negative team. So for those 3 people who changed their minds, and those 2 people who opted not to vote,
The second time.
that hands the debate to the affirmative team slightly. Congratulations.
So that's it. Thank you so much for